Hey everybody, it's your girl Desiree. I'm back with another live stream video. I'm gonna try not to have this too long because I know I can talk, but today I wanted to talk about what complex trauma recovery actually looks like. Now, complex trauma is a topic that has become more and more popular on here over the years. It's something that I found out about, maybe give or take. It's been maybe almost 5 years or so. I'm not really sure, but it has been over a decade now since I've been doing the internal work. I just didn't have a name for it at the time. Um, but I kind of wanted to talk about what recovery actually looks like. A lot of times when we think of recovery, we think only of people who have addictions to substances. But recovery comes in many different forms. And when you have dealt with complex trauma in your childhood, which is basically, I talked about it in other videos that you can look at, but it's a series of traumatic experiences. There's a process of recovery that you go through so that you can heal and evolve and move closer and closer to the person that you are meant to be. So, I want to talk about the 5 stages of grief, and that's another thing that some people are probably already aware of. A lot of times when we think of grief when it comes to the loss of a loved one when they die, but grief can be many different things because death is not just physical death, right? There's different forms of death, and I would like to talk about that in another video. But grief is not just the loss of a loved one. And many times when you're going through recovery from complex trauma, you go through a lot of grief. And there are 5 stages of grief that people tend to go through. Now, you don't always go through all of them. And sometimes you may also not go through them in a certain order. So there's a certain order that's typically talked about. But the whole goal is to eventually get to the end of acceptance. So let's quickly just go to the website here that I found. This is clevelandclinic.org. What are the stages of grief? The 5 phases of loss are denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. But they don't always happen in that order, which is what I just said. Okay, so it says there's no way around it. Grief is never easy, and though we tend to associate grief with death, other life events can trigger grief too, from the end of a relationship and the loss of a job to financial hardship. It says grief is a natural response to any kind of loss, says clinical psychologist Regina Jossel. Psych D. People experience it in different ways, but typically it includes a variety of intense emotions like sadness, anger, irritability, and guilt. Dr. Gelso explains the 5 stages of grief, including what they are, how they manifest, and when to seek support from a therapist who can help you cope. So the 5 stages of grief are denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. It says some people include other stages of grief too, like shock, disorganization, testing, and more. So these are the 5 stages of grief. Denial is kind of like you're not being able to accept that something is occurring, right? So you may have experienced certain things in your childhood that it's hard for you to accept it, right? It's hard for you to come to terms with that. So you may say, "Oh, that didn't happen," or wasn't as bad as it was, or it could have been worse. Like, you minimize it or whatever, instead of saying that this is actually what occurred and this is how it affected me, right? So a lot of times denial is the first stage, not always, but many times it's the first stage for going through recovery in life. And they talk about the same thing when people have addictions to substances. They have to accept that, they have to acknowledge, I should say, they have to acknowledge that I am a person who is an alcoholic. I am a person who is a heroin addict, right? They have to acknowledge it, because if they won't even acknowledge it, then how are they going to work through it, right? If you say, well, I don't have an alcohol problem, when you clearly do, then how are you going to work through it, right? So denial is natural because we don't want to accept that we have a area in our lives that needs work, especially if it's something that's very painful, even if it's something that was done to us, a lot of times we still don't want to accept it or acknowledge it, because when I should say acknowledge it rather than accept it, because acknowledgement is the first step. But we don't want to acknowledge it because sometimes there's also shame attached to it as well. Even if it's something that we didn't even do, there can still be shame. A lot of times, shame even runs in our families, and we've been raised within shame. Even Tim Fletcher, who I have watched a lot, I haven't watched him as often lately, but I've done a lot of binge watching on him in the past. And he talks a lot about how shame is very, very rooted in complex trauma. So, a lot of times, because of the shame, we don't want to acknowledge certain things that have occurred. But it's important for us to acknowledge that that this has occurred. Bargaining is something, it says the bargaining process sometimes happens before the loss has fully occurred. Like when you think, if I can recover from cancer, I promise I'll start going to church. Or if my husband survives this heart attack, I'll never argue with him again. Um, so bargaining is kind of like trying to, that one is a little harder for me to explain, but I feel like it's kind of like trying to buy time or trying to like negotiate. You know what I mean? Like, like for example, if you're in a relationship with somebody and you know that you should leave because the person doesn't want you in the same way you want them, you may bargain and say, well, maybe if I try a little harder, then he will, want to do X, Y, Z. Or maybe if I stay a little longer, or maybe if I do this or do that, instead of just acknowledging that he's not going to do that. And maybe there's a possibility that he could, but you've been sitting around longer than you should already, right? So you have to come out of that stage, because that stage is only going to prolong the grieving process. But it's easy to stay in a bargaining stage because you don't want to go through the depression and the anger and all the other stages of grief. So bargaining kind of allows you to be in a stage where it's like, oh, I can do this, or I can try that, or maybe if this happens and this will happen. It keeps you from experiencing the other things. And then the next stage is anger, right? So anger, we know what anger is. Anger is when you have a strong negative emotion towards something. It can even be rage. Obviously, there's different levels of anger, but anger is also part of grief. And a lot of times, I have an episode on a podcast that I was doing before. I haven't done it in a while, my holistic podcast, but I talked about how anger is like kind of like, I don't remember how I entitled that episode, but I was basically saying that anger is depression. I think anger is depression suppressed. And a lot of times we don't see anger as a form of depression. We don't see anger as a form of grief, because we associate anger with like, oh, I want to fight, or, oh, like I'm going to, do this, do that. We don't see it as a form of like, we don't see it in relation to sadness or relation to depression. But depression can manifest itself in different forms, just like how grief can manifest itself in different forms. So anger is one of those forms that grief manifests itself as at times. And I know for me, I wasn't really like allowed to show much anger or much expression growing up. And then on top of that, you being a woman, it's like you're looked at sideways for expressing anger, right? Like, of course, women can cry, it's kind of a little iffy for when you're a Black woman, right? But outside of that, women can cry for the most part. At least other women will not penalize you for that if they're relatively healthy. But anger is something that a lot of times you don't really get to express. So a lot of times we don't want to express anger, but anger in of itself is not bad. Anger in of itself is something that can be healthy in order for us to see what's really going on inside of us, to release whatever it has built up. And it's just a matter of how we express our anger and how we channel it, and we don't allow it to consume us or cause us to do things that could be very destructive to ourselves or to other people. I think it's more so just how we go about it. Depression is another stage. So, kind of briefly, already talked about depression, but depression can be a stage, but you can also have clinical depression, right? So, that's also something that could be chronic. But in this context, depression would be like a stage of grief for many people. And then the last stage is acceptance, when you come to the realization that, you know, this is what it is. This is what happened. I went through these different stages: anger, depression, bargaining, denial, and now I'm at this place now where this is what I'm accepting. And it may not mean that the grief may fully go away, like it says, the pain of your grief may never fully fade, but you get to a point where you're no longer like consumed by it, and you can move forward and live your life in a way that is you're not crippled by what has occurred in your life. So I kind of wanted to talk about that because I just think that it's important to talk about grief. So it says here, do the stages always happen in order? These stages are meant to be descriptive, not prescriptive. So basically, it's just a way to describe it, not to say that, oh, it's going to happen for everybody. This means they won't necessarily apply to everyone, which is what I just said, or happen in the order presented. It's common to weave in and out of stages and experience elements of them at the same time. True. That's another thing too. Sometimes you can experience anger and depression, like sadness, at the same time. You could be bargaining but still be angry, right? You can have denial and then be angry, right? There could be multiple things. You can get to a place where you thought you accepted it. Maybe you did accept some parts of it, and then you go back into some other anger again. It really just depends on the context of the situation, the person. But when we're talking about complex trauma, a lot of times complex trauma, it starts in the childhood. So these are things that are very rooted in, and they are very ingrained, right? So it's going to take a long time to kind of unpack those things. So I also wanted to mention that healing is really a 1, 2, 3 process. Most recovery processes are not linear. So for most people, they're not going to just go through a linear process, which is like a straight process through, and then all of a sudden now I'm healed and I'm better. That's not how recovery is for most people. Most people, it's going to be like a roller coaster. It's going to be like they're going through a terrain, like they're hiking. When you go through situations like, for example, an obstacle course, right? It's never like a straight thing there. You got to swing here. You got to go through this. You got to fit through this tight space. You got to jump over here and jump over there, right? Until you finally get to the other side. So that's kind of how recovery is for a lot of people as well. It's usually not going to be a 1, 2, 3 thing. And a lot of times as humans, we don't want to go through pain because naturally our bodies, our mind, our whole spirit is not designed for us to be in pain. Our bodies is going to do whatever it can to try to minimize pain, right? So this is why we go sometimes to places of escape and to some people go to alcohol, some people go to sex, some people go to relationships, people go to food, different things, so that they don't have to deal with the process of pain and healing and growth. Because like I said, naturally our body, mind, everything is going to try to do whatever it can to avoid going through that pain. So it's just natural that you're going to have these ups and downs. And sometimes I have to remind myself of that because sometimes I get very discouraged, or I get very angry at myself, like, oh, you should be over this by now, or why are you still struggling in this area? Why are you still sad about that? But another thing I also wrote down too is that there's also triggers. So sometimes different songs, different things that we watch, even content we may watch on YouTube, we may have flashbacks. There may be certain relationships that we end up in, whether it be romantic, friendships, family, and they may say or do things that trigger us, especially romantic relationships that are, romantic relationships are intimate, right? All relationships can be intimate. But when you are, especially if you're physically intimate with somebody, it really kind of like unhashes a lot of stuff. Like even with men, they may be all cool and collective at one point, but then once they start getting, more and more involved with you, you start seeing, they start lashing out sometimes, or they start going through their own stuff, and you see their own stuff coming up, right? And that's just natural because now this person is like a mirror. They're reflecting you to yourself. And a lot of times we don't want to deal with that. So we'll try to like, project stuff back onto the other person. Like, no, it's you, you're the person, you're the problem. Well, because we don't want to see ourselves. And sometimes maybe we are not the wrong in that situation. But even if we're not wrong, there's always still something we can learn from relationships that we are in with other people. But even if it's a song, even if it's a movie, even if it's something we're watching on YouTube that triggers us and makes us sad or makes us angry and brings up certain things from our childhood and from our past, then we want to kind of like pay attention to that and say, okay, why am I triggered by certain things, certain topics trigger me? Because like me personally, I know there's certain topics that trigger me. And I've even had where like, especially a guy may call it out and say, oh, you're triggered by these type of things. And of course you don't want to hear that. But it's like you sit there and you think, you know what, I am really triggered by these type of conversations or these type of things. I get really riled up and really angry, and it starts an argument because there's certain things that I haven't worked through. So I think that it's important to pay attention to those triggers. And that's a part of the recovery process too. You're going to get triggered. And that's one thing that's hard because we don't want to be triggered, because we don't want to go through and have flashbacks and things start coming back up of things that we've already experienced, especially in our childhood. So it's very difficult. It's easy to just shut that down because we don't want to feel those emotions, those triggers. Another thing is also um, that some aspects of like recovery may be more complex depending on the person, right? So for me being a woman, me being a Black woman, like there are certain things that, because of the way, how society is, there's certain things like as I'm healing, I had to unpack so many things, so many ideologies that I came to believe about women or about being Black or being a Black woman. And also navigating growing up as a Black girl and as a Black girl who was a teenager and me now being a woman, it even all of that played a role into the trauma as well. And I've had to like unpack that and unhash that as well. So make sure that you also take that into consideration. People say, oh, everything is not about race, everything is not about gender. Yes, sometimes it's not always about that, but we do live in a world that has a lot of different social constructs. So we cannot just, you know, say, oh, those things don't affect me. They do, right? So some people, they're affected by it more than others, depending on their phenotype, depending on their experiences. But those things may have also played a role in that. So you have to, if it doesn't affect you that much, then it doesn't affect you that much. But you just have to make sure that you are being cognizant of that. Um, Also, withdrawal. So when you're going through recovery from trauma, there's withdrawals that you go through. So we think of withdrawals, once again, like I mentioned at the beginning, we think of recovery as only with people who are recovering from alcohol, recovering from heroin, recovering from gambling or different addictions. No, recovery is also involved when you're healing from things like complex trauma, and you're going to have withdrawals. It's going to vary from person to person, but sometimes we use different things to escape, like I've already mentioned, so we don't have to deal with certain stuff. So if you were always escaping to alcohol, sex, relationships, like you couldn't be by yourself, you couldn't be single. Maybe you're a workaholic, maybe you're a person who's always spending, or, running after this and running after that. Whatever it was for you, you're going to have to now withdraw from that because you're using that as a crutch and as an escape to not deal with stuff. So now you have to move away from that, whether it be food, right? Even things that could be relatively healthy, like food. We have to eat. Food is if you eat relatively healthy, that can even be of sustenance to you. That can even be of something that can help you evolve. But we also don't want to use food as a way to escape either. So whatever it might be, me personally, I would suggest to just get rid of the alcohol altogether. But then there are other things like food that you cannot. I'm not going to tell you just don't eat. No, you're not going to survive, but for so long without food. So you have to eat. Some things are actual necessities, right? That's when it gets a little more complicated, when you have you're trying to withdraw from something that you actually need, like food or work, right? You actually need to work to make money in some context of work, whether that be working for yourself, working for a regular job. It's just a matter of finding a way to be balanced in it. So there's nothing wrong with relationships. But sometimes we have to take a step back and really focus on ourselves. And I talked about that many years ago. People didn't really like it. And people didn't really like it. And they let me see what it is. Oh, I didn't even see somebody was in the the comments. Hello. Yeah, so basically, sorry, I got a little distracted. I didn't even see somebody was somebody sent the message here. But Yeah, when it comes to different things that we try to escape to, we have to find a balance. So you don't want to overeat, you don't want to overwork, you don't want to be in a state where you okay, that's what I was basically saying. So basically what I was saying was that years ago when I said it, some people didn't really like it and now it's become popular, over a decade later. But sometimes it's important to take some time off of relationships, romantic relationships in particular. You know, it's not always sometimes we need to learn to be by ourselves. And a lot of people struggle with that. It's not just women, it's men as well. I think men a lot of times are very codependent and they always put it on to women, but that's not always true. I notice a lot of women now are actually in relationships and they're leaving or they're just haven't been in relationships in a very, very long time. So I think that people need to learn to be with themselves because sometimes there's a lot of internal work that you need to do that you can't really do if you're always constantly in a relationship. So it's not to say that you probably can't be doing the work while you're in a relationship with somebody, but it's not the same when you are completely single, not having sex, not dating at all, and just focusing completely on your growth. Sometimes that's very important for people, especially no sex, because that clouds a lot of things. And that can even be an escape that you're using to not deal with things. So that's why I say it's so important sometimes. I would say at least 3 or 4 years. I know some people are going to say, oh, that's so extreme. I can't go that long. Okay, well, it's up to you. Obviously, everybody's different. Some people may go 10 years. Some people may go 5. Some people may only go 1 or 2. But I feel like you're going to know how long you need. Some people don't want to do it. Okay, well, then that's up to you. But just know that many people will benefit from that because they will learn to be with themselves. They will learn to be with themselves. Um, yeah, so and the last thing I'm gonna say is that when it comes to recovering from complex trauma, it's also like a body nervous system thing. That's something that I learned a little later on, especially through watching Tim Fletcher. A lot of times we may struggle with anxiety. We may struggle with being disassociated, not being connected with our bodies, especially as women. Just because you're having sexual intercourse with a man does not mean that you are connected to your body, does not mean that you're comfortable with your sexuality, does not mean that you're comfortable with yourself. No, it doesn't mean any of that. You don't have to be confident and comfortable in yourself to have sex. A lot of women are actually having sex in situations where they may not even be comfortable even in what they're actually doing. You know what I mean? That actually is pretty common. So it's with doing the internal work and growth that you will become more connected to your body. When you have been through complex trauma, you have to many times learn to become more connected with yourself because you have been fragmented in many ways. You have disassociated in many ways. You have developed a lot of maladaptive behaviors in order to cope. So you may not even be your full real self. You may just have all these different personalities that you created. All types of things could be occurring, right? So it's a lot of grounding and doing the internal work, being comfortable with your body, being aware of your body, being aware of triggers, being aware of why you have certain feelings that you're feeling, and trying to find ways to make your body feel more and more safe. That's another thing too. If you've been through complex trauma, for the most part, 9 times out of 10, you haven't felt safe. Even if you didn't go through any like physical abuse per se, but you were in unsafe environments. So because of that, you have to now put yourself in a situation where now you can feel safe within your body. You can feel safe within your mind. And when you're a person like me who's a heavy thinker, it's very difficult. It's like, I don't know how to even turn this brain off because it's constantly firing off. And in a way, that's a good thing because I always have all these ideas. But it's not healthy if it's firing off in ways that are creating fear or emotions that are not conducive, right? So you want to make sure that you are learning to become more comfortable with yourself, learning really who you really are, learning to let go of a lot of the masks that you've learned to wear, learning to let go of a lot of the maladaptive behaviors, the things that you have used to escape not dealing with your trauma, sitting with yourself, being comfortable with yourself. I'm so glad I started that years ago of going out to eat by myself, learning to travel by myself, just learning to do things by myself, speaking out loud to myself, like just being comfortable with myself because you're really all you have at the end of the day. And when you have become codependent, you don't necessarily, and not all people who have complex trauma are codependents. Some people can be narcissistic, right? There's different things here, but I'm speaking from experience. When you have been codependent, you tend to rely on so much on other people, and I still struggle with that in some ways. But I think that I have been doing a lot of work to really learn to not always rely on other people. Most of the time, people are not even going to understand what I'm going through anyway, because most of the people in my circle have not gone through the stuff that I've gone through. So they have no clue what it is that I'm feeling. So I have to make sure that I am giving myself what I need. And I think that the more you do that, the more you can also be of help to other people because you've done the internal work. You become more and more comfortable with yourself. And then when you get around other people, they can enjoy you too because you are learning to enjoy yourself. It's easier said than done. I know for me right now, I'm going through a period where I've been going through a lot of anger and depression and things like that because I'm in a certain phase of my life where I'm not where I want to be. And I know that that's another conversation for another day. I don't want to talk too much about that in this live. But I think that like that kind of goes back to the ebbs and flows, right? Even though I've done a lot of work over a decade now I'm in like a very hard place right now for like the last year or so. So I think that it's definitely important to kind of understand why you're in that phase. Learning to be gentle with yourself, give yourself rest, and give yourself what you need in that time of recovery and healing as you go through the different phases of healing. Um, so I hope that this has been helpful. I hope this is helpful to somebody else who wants to either start their journey or who has already started their journey. And yeah, so I will come back on here another time, but I wanted to talk about what it really looks like because a lot of times people talk about, oh, recovery and love yourself and respect yourself and blah, blah, blah. They just say these, these generic phrases. Like, what does that even mean, right? But talking about the nitty gritty and the stuff that you actually may go through, I think it's important so that when people experience those 5 stages of grief and all the different things that I mentioned, the triggers and all the different things, they won't be surprised. They won't be confused why they're feeling that. They won't be confused when it feels like a roller coaster and in 1 minute they feel like they're getting better. Next minute they feel this way. They won't be confused because they've already heard this. So take care and I will come back with another video. Bye.